Welcome to Democracy Dialogues, a conversation we need to be having now about the state of democracy in the Americas. I'm Eric Farnsworth, your series host. Our guest today is Dr. Julio Guzmán, Peruvian politician, leader, and founder of the Partido Morado centrist political national party. Julio ran for president in Peru's 2016 elections and was in close contention before he was forced from the race in a politically motivated administrative action. He has served in senior government positions in Peru, worked in the private sector, and spent a decade here in Washington with the Inter-American Development Bank. Today, in addition to teaching at my alma mater, Princeton University, Dr. Guzmán is a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, where he has been doing some groundbreaking investigative work on China's Latin American power play. In fact, that's the title of a piece he just had published in Foreign Affairs magazine. And it's getting wide distribution and very favorable commentary from numerous knowledgeable observers. Dr. Guzmán, welcome to Democracy Dialogues.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for the invitation.
Before we get to Peru, let's explore China's emerging activities in the Americas. Many observers seem to be missing some of the points you've been discussing. What's your main thesis?
In order to understand Chinese presence in Latin America, it's important to understand the role of China today. Everything that happened in the developing world is conditioned and is related to what is going on within China. And I would like to see it in three different layers. The first one is, what is the strategic goal that China is pursuing? The second one is, what's the strategy in order to get to that goal? And finally, the tactics. In terms of the first one, indeed, there are a complete debate about if Chinese strategic goal is to survive, and that's why they are doing this, or it's a different kind of approach to have a domination of or creation of new global order. Independently of the strategic goal, what we know for a fact is the strategy and the tactics that they are using. In terms of a strategy, we have an economic, a political, and a military strategy in order to achieve that goal. And the tactics that we know are pretty known for us. And I'm going to go to Latin America. I think, in my opinion, aside from Chinese interests in the developing world, Latin America is important for them for raw materials, first of all, foodstuff, and the productivity potential of the region. China has been going through a process in which middle classes has been expanding because of growth. That means more demands for food, but for higher quality food. Latin America today...
Steak instead of chicken.
Oh, that's one example, for instance. Yep. That's one example for that. But Latin America, aside from offering raw materials and also foodstuff, we need to remember that Latin America is the first continent in the world with more sources of energy. Latin America is the first region in the world with the more productive capacity to produce food. And also Latin America is the first one with the highest biodiversity in the world. So from a very pragmatic and economic point of view, China has an interest. But the second one is more political. China has found an opportunity in the global order in which the United States and the West in general has backed off from multilateralism. And China is willing and is expecting to fill that gap. In order to take advantage of that multilateralism in a Chinese point of view, China needs to add up allies and take advantage of the fact that a boat from Colombia or Peru is equal to the boat of the United States in a multilateral scheme. So I found those two the most important interests of China in our region.
It's interesting because what you've just described, what the Chinese might say is, well, that's exactly what the United States is doing, raw materials and access to markets and also, wanting allies and that sort of thing. But you also write that China's activities in the Western Hemisphere is undermining democracy Tell us what you mean by that and help us understand why you think that democracy itself is being undermined.
Well, the logic follows exactly from what I said.
Mm-hmm.
In order to achieve the interest that I described, China is eroding not only democracy but also the rule of law. And why? For instance, in order to get access to raw materials, China it's exerting some behaviors like corruption, cases that are already in the public dominion about bribing people. The other thing is that China, one of the best ways in which is intervening in the region is through lending contracts. And we know for a fact that those lending contracts have some characteristics that are eroding institutions. For instance, the characteristic of being not transparent, that those contracts are confidential and cannot be published, which is against the law of most Latin American countries.
These are contracts with governments?
Yes, government to government, government to government. And the second one, it's this condition that the Chinese has put over Latin America to repay China first if the country goes into
as a
into
privileged
default.
creditor.
Exactly,
Yep.
which breaks international rules. But the most damaging condition of these lending contracts is the possibility of China to force countries to repay if the countries create a public policy which is against Chinese interest in general. So this is a very specific case in which, in order to achieve their objectives, the collateral effects, it's eroding the rule of law and at the same time rights. And why? Because in this effort, we have seen effects on the environment, in the conditions that the Chinese investment is going to Latin America, but also labor standards. And when we are talking about labor standards, rights, when we are talking about corruption, and we are talking the capability of doing this without respecting our values and our way of living, I think that becomes a much worse problem. Right?
So what you're describing is really interesting because many people in Latin America will complain about U.S. engagement financially because they say, well, the money comes sometimes, but it comes with a lot of conditions. But what you're suggesting is that Chinese money also comes with significant conditions. They're just different conditions and perhaps impinge on the actual sovereignty of the country. What does it mean that a country goes against Chinese interests? How is that defined? Is that ever spelled out in these contracts, or is it just some sort of general political basket that the Chinese can say, well, you've gone against our interests here, so we're going to call our loan? How does that work in practice?
Well, there is a very interesting study made by a group of think tanks here in Washington that they got access to 100 different lending contracts in the developing world made by the Chinese. And they found evidence that those kinds of conditions are really, in fact, are included in these programs. One of the examples that I always put is, let's imagine that you are the Minister of Finance in a Latin American country.
I wish I were.
How are you going to manage the finances of a country if you cannot acknowledge the existence of contracts because of one of the conditions is secrecy? How are you going to manage the finances of the country if you are forced to pay one creditor first if you goes into repayment? And the situation of Latin America right now is so sensitive, is so problematic and complex in terms of their finances, that this is decreasing the degrees of freedom of the ministries and the authorities in general in order to make a policy. So there are very concrete examples on how China, in this process of achieving his interests, are eroding the rule of law and are cutting rights and are not respecting the market. Because we can talk about political issues, but at the same time market. You made a comparison between the West in Latin America and China, and I will say that at least we have some the assurance that the basic general conditions and how market works are set there. Markets is not only about the ability of businesses to get into profits, but also the assurance that the environment are going to be respected, that the right of consumers and workers are going to be respected. And I think this is not happening in the case of Chinese intervention.
I mean, you're describing a really interesting scenario. Latin America right now is coming out of COVID. The debt loads are increasing. The dollar remains relatively high. Inflation is increasing. Interest rates are going up. So you can present a scenario for the Western Hemisphere, much of Latin America indeed, and the Caribbean as well, with economies are going to be stressed. And new lending, new financial resources will be required. But you do have some observers who are saying, well, because of that, and because of China's own circumstances, maybe China's engagement is going to decrease in Latin America coming over the next few months and years. You think exactly the opposite. Tell us why.
Well, I think it's gonna be the opposite because of two reasons. Because it's gonna be more supply of Chinese resources in order to do that, but at the same time more demand for Latin American countries. In the first case, China, what it's doing is applying a new, different economic strategy. China is trying to move from an economy based of light manufacturers to an economy who is more sophisticated. And in order to do that, China needs to diversify their investments, not only within China, but particularly abroad. The only way to increase productivity is to invest in new areas. And that means that the developing world will have the more potential and opportunities in order to do that. China is going to be more present. If we see the data, for instance, in the case of Latin America, we see a huge change in the pattern of Chinese investment from natural resources to more added value industries. One of the channels or the instruments, the tools that the Chinese are going to prioritize and put in more efforts is the Belt and Road initiatives. Why? Because this is the perfect financial tool and arm to execute this strategy.
And you've seen that up close in terms of Peru and Chinese investment in Peru. And we're going to come to Peru in just a second. But let me ask you this question. In your article with Foreign Affairs, you wrote that China invests in mines, in other words, copper and tin and extractive sector. But the West should invest in minds, in other words, human capital. And I wonder if, number one, that is an issue that people have been receiving that message favorably, and if you sense that there might be some progress on that, number one. But number two, that's a generational issue. It's going to take a while to change minds and understand, the differences between the Western form of governance and Chinese form of governance, etc. What are some things that the West could be doing now that you would recommend, in addition to investing in human capital, that might be able to address some of the issues that you're talking about?
Well, first of all, I will to address briefly the first point about mines. I believe that, I know for sure that the most important variables defining human progress is the rule of law and good governance. That's the most important factors according to the evidence. I'm not talking ideologically, I'm talking about data. But my question is, what are the conditions that create rule of law and good governance? Are values and principles. It's not money. What creates institutions and the way we live, it's how people think, are the principles of them. So if we want to change this situation, if we want a Latin America to really believe in their own values, we don't need to change, we don't need to pour more money. What we need to do is to try to help Latin Americans to think differently, to educate them. So that's why my main message is that we need to invest in people. We need to invest in human capital. But putting that aside, because it's going to take time, I was always telling that it's going to take at least 10 years in order to see results. I think there is a second priority that could be done right now, and it's engage to solidify, to strengthen the economic and the commercial relationship between Latin America and the West. And why? Because when you do business with someone, when you have a business partner, it's much more difficult to fight with him, right? Because there are other interests at stake. There will be always a space for negotiation, for talk, to try to resolve things, because our progress is already defined by a structure that already exists. And in that case, that's my point. I think the West should not prioritize governments, because governments change every 4 or 5 years in Latin America, and you see the changes from the right to the left. No, I think what the negotiation, the contract, the new international contract should be with the actors who made progress possible in Latin America, which is, for instance, the private sector. And one of the ways that we can do that is to take advantage of something that already exists, that are the free trade agreements. Politically speaking, for the West, it's very difficult at this time to try to increase the commercial ties through new commercial preferences, because that issue is politically sensitive right now. But we need to build on things that already exist. The free trade agreements, in my experience, has been used maybe only 10% of the whole potential. And I think that's the new agenda of the West with Latin America. The idea is that how we can make that US businesses and West businesses could be positioned in a much more ambitious way in Latin America, and Latin American businesses can benefit from that. Examples about that are, first, how we can improve all the things that are related with trade facilitation, customs, infrastructure imports, the idea of strengthening agencies that need to deal with phytosanitary conditions or regulations of those kinds of things. What we're going to do in order to promote more productivity in Latin American businesses through innovation, technology, to try to engage more with the United States. Those kinds of things that I believe are real, are possible, and we don't need to invest any more political capital in order to do that.
The irony is, just as Latin America and the Caribbean are looking for indeed that increased economic engagement from the West itself is somehow pulling back. And I think it's a really good message for you and the rest of us who believe in trade and investment as a driver of development to continue to urge Washington and other capitals to say, look, Latin America is a huge opportunity. China's not there because it's not an opportunity. They're there because it is an opportunity. So why aren't we more aggressively pursuing and providing some of these resources that the region clearly needs, and I believe would be in our interest to do so. But I think you're encapsulating those comments very effectively. And look, I mean, the region is right now up for grabs, it seems, in terms of what path will the region pursue. And if one country is providing things that the region wants and needs, and another isn't, it seems to be a relatively easy choice.
That's a very good point that you're making, that the reason why China is now in Latin America is because the United States and the West have taken for granted Latin America. Yeah. They have been absent for the last 30 years. So this is not happening because of magic. This is happening because as consequences of geopolitical decisions. Ways, for instance, examples really concrete is tax treaties.
Yes.
Tax treaties is a way to reducing the transaction costs of businesses, maybe 35-40% of their businesses that they make with the state. How many countries have tax treaties with the United States? How many of them? And the other thing is that show more interest in the region. Just as 12 Latin American countries do not have U.S. ambassadors right now. 12. In the last 15 years, U.S. presidents has visited Latin America 5 times, but Xi Jinping, in the same period, 11 times, being on the other side all over the world. So I believe that economic engagement should be should go with a political engagement, and this ability to start talking again with Latin America, but in the same codes. One strategic way of doing that is, please don't do things that only are of interest of the United States. Do things that Latin American countries want. And I believe that U.S. policy in the past has been driven by the U.S. priorities. And if you want to engage more, if you want to increase confidence and trust, you should look at what Latin American countries want. And listening me to most of the countries in Latin America in regarding to the United States, what they want is to make business. Is to make business in equal conditions. I don't want gifts. I don't want seeing like the little brother in which I need to help because he doesn't go. No. If the United States starts treating Latin American countries in the same way and giving what really they want to make businesses, I think the relation could be much better. The opportunities, I think, are there. One of them is the supply chain restriction. This has been a huge problem in the world, but has created an opportunity. How we can start investing in Latin America to try to substitute progressively, because it's not going to be overnight, substituting the production that now it's doing in Asia. It's complex, it's difficult, but we need to start thinking about that.
It's an important message. Thank you for bringing that to us today. We're here with Dr. Julio Guzmán, who is serving a fellowship with the National Endowment for Democracy here in Washington. He's just written a very important piece in Foreign Affairs magazine about China's ambitions in Latin America. Julio, you're also Peruvian. You're a senior political leader in your home country of Peru. You've both been in elected politics and appointed politics, and you understand at the pinnacle of government how countries work, and you've seen many things. Many of us outside Peru are confused about what's going on right now, however, in the country. The crisis is ongoing, the democratic crisis. Without going into all the details that perhaps many people already know, how did we get here in the first place? And second, do you see a path forward to strengthen Peruvian democracy coming out of this crisis, which has really shaken the country to its roots?
Well, there are two ways of analyzing what's going on in Peru. One is to analyze the circumstances, the details, and the other way is to analyze the structural reasons why this is happening. And I would like to focus more on the second one. And the reason why this is happening in Peru is because we have not had political reform and electoral reform in the last 30 years in Peru. And what I'm saying is that the lack of reform has created loopholes, political loopholes, in which taking out a president from immediately, closing the Congress, it's so easy that you can do it in 2 days in Peru. And I've been there because I was working with our party, who was elected in the parliament, and I've seen how in 2 days a president could be kicked out, and in 2 days a Congress could be closed. Why? Because the way in which our constitution declares or defines how the president could be taken out and Congress could be closed are so ambiguous and ample. So that's what I'm saying about changes in the constitution and political reform. Another example is that it's incredible that in a presidential regime like Peru, the president cannot choose their cabinet if Congress does not approve his cabinet, being the president already elected. So this is a huge contradiction that gives the tools and the conditions for the political crisis to arise. And when I'm talking about electoral reform, it's also the same thing. Is that we have a political system, political parties that indeed they are not political parties. They are just official papers or certificates in order to run, and that creates a lot of corruption. That's instead of attracting good people that they want to do changes, that kind of system attract people that want the government to do business. So why we're going to be surprised that Peruvian Congress is not all, but in majority, take out by people that have only economic interests, because the system creates the incentives for those people to be in Congress. One example, in Peru we have the preferential vote, which means that 120 candidates for your party that goes to the Congress with. Each candidate has a number. Okay, 1, 2, well, if you have the number 37, it doesn't matter, because you can put there $80 million and you get elected. So if you have a system that gives you that incentives for money and for groups of power that are not the businessmen or the people that want to play the market rules, but I'm talking about illegal mining, I'm talking about drug dealing, I'm talking about smuggling and other things, it's a very easy and a very convenient system to get into power. Peru has a political and electoral rules that are serving the groups of society that want to benefit themselves and not the population. If we don't do those reforms, I assure that the next president elected is going to be exactly the same as the last one.
I think you've put your finger exactly on the key point, but it's also a challenge, because if you begin to reform the electoral process and the political process, which I completely agree is needed, you then perhaps open the door to a full constitutional rewrite. And we've seen other countries around Latin America where passions have taken over, political interests have gotten involved, and the constitutional rewrite becomes very problematic for democracy itself, leading in some cases to Venezuela or other countries like that. And my question is, how do you reform without unleashing public passions to the point where you lose the entire system? Is that a possibility, or is that something, because we're struggling with those issues as observers, how does that happen in a country like Peru, which is a democracy, but a relatively young democracy?
Well, there are two ways. One is the legal way, and the other is the political one.
Okay.
In legal way, the Peruvian constitution allows changes in the constitution without rewriting the whole constitution. I'm going to explain two. One is that if Congress votes by 2/3 2 times in order to make those changes in the constitution, it is possible. It is possible to make changes, in particular.
But a fractured Congress probably isn't going to do that, is it?
Well, that's the political side. But legally speaking, it is possible to make those changes and to do it quickly and to do it. The political way of doing this is to push Congress, to force Congress to do it. In the following manner. Congress wants to stay. Congressmen wants to stay. The longer, the better for them, because of their economic interest. But the Peruvian constitution has a provision that gives the president the ability to resign and call for elections immediately. Okay? Congress does not want that, because if the president do that, their job is finished. So one of the ways doing that is to force Congress to say, if you don't make political and electoral reforms for the next elections, I'm going to resign tomorrow. And with that conditions, I believe that Congress will have the incentives and the last resort to make those changes. What is the problem now in Peru in order to do that? One is that 2 months ago or 3 months ago, the current president has the popular support, the enough popular support to push Congress to make those decisions. However, in these months, the brutality of the authorities to repress the street manifestations has been so high that we have 50 people dead, and there is evidence that most of them has been killed because of abuse. And that has taken a lot of political capital from the president, because now the majority of the population do not want her. So I think her mistakes has made her have fewer and fewer political options.
President Dina Boluarte.
Exactly. And And what is the consequence of that is that most of the population, I would say 60%, 3 months ago, agree that the elections should be done with political and electoral reforms. Now, after 50 people have died, most of the population has changed their mind and they want elections right now. What is the problem of doing elections right now? That the system is not going to change. The rules are not going to change. So the next president that is going to be chosen, it's going to be exactly the same. And we're going to have exactly the same political crisis.
Well, you're describing a real dilemma, aren't you? I mean, this is a challenge. We only have a couple minutes remaining, but I want to bring the two strands of these conversations together, which is China and also Peru. In political chaos, if you have individual actors who are, in some cases, for sale, because the political parties are vehicles for individual advancement and vanity projects, etc. Perhaps, and this is a question, perhaps that offers avenues for engagement with corruption, or when people are looking for permission to make investments or land use projects or investing in ports and infrastructure and things like that. Is that an issue that you've seen that China takes advantage of in the context of Peru and perhaps more broadly? Or is China actually repelled by some of the political machinations and chaos that has recently been observed in Peru, but in other countries as well?
I think Peru is one case, but I believe this situation is going to happen in the whole region. It's happening, and it's going to be worse in the whole region. And why? Because if you're experiencing political crisis, and you are experiencing the economic stress that Latin America is experiencing right now, and is getting worse and worse, the political elite will have more likelihood to be captured, of course.
Yes.
And even honest people will think twice about playing in the limit of the law, because the pressure is going to be so high that Latin American countries will need cash, and will need cash quickly. And the options that they have are very few. They have the international commercial banks, that the financial cost has been increasing. Then you have the multilaterals, which takes a lot of time, and the third option is China, who China gives you cash immediately. It takes 1 month to execute that, and that help also bring its with conditions and the conditions that we already have. So I believe that the problem is not only the capture of the political elite, but also is the following, that the population will be more prone to accept the situation. Why? Because political crisis and economical crisis will create a household situation in which people will be more prone to listen to this mermaid calls that things
siren
could
calls,
be, siren that could be resolved immediately, and that's a perfect scenario for an actor like China, who we already know how it deals with the developing world.
Dr. Julio Guzmán, you've been doing some very important work to help us understand what's going on in terms of democratic trends and engagement of outsiders in Latin America. I want to thank you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues. You've really given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate your time, and I hope that you'll come back at some point, perhaps with an update of some of your additional findings. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here at Democracy Dialogues as well. This is a conversation that we have every month, and we look forward to having you join us again next month as we bring you another of our very important guests from leading advocates and analysts and advisors from across the region. Until that time, for Democracy Dialogues here at the America Society and Council of the Americas, I'm Eric Farnsworth, wishing you a very good day.